Racist restaurant employee kicks out a black veteran, unaware who's watching. James Thornton had always carried himself in a quiet way. As a veteran of the Gulf War, he had seen more than his fair share of hardship and challenge. But nothing, not even the heat of battle, had prepared him for the everyday war he would fight when he returned home. The reminders that no matter what he had done for his country, he was still a black man in America. It had been years since James left the military, but his life remained disciplined and structured. Every morning, he woke at 5:30 a.m., went for a long run, and spent the rest of his day working in security. The routine gave him a sense of control, of peace, but deep down, he knew that the world outside his door wasn't always so orderly. On this particular evening, after a long day at work, James decided to stop by Harrison's Diner, a popular spot in town. He had been there before, but not often. It wasn't the kind of place where he felt entirely comfortable. Harrison's had a reputation. Some called it sweet or charming, but James had heard whispers of how the restaurant staff, particularly a few bad apples, treated customers who didn't quite fit the regular clientele. Still, James was hungry, and the diner was close by. He entered, the familiar bell above the door jingling as he stepped inside. The restaurant was about half full, with a few families scattered among the booths and a couple of people seated at the counter. The warm scent of frying bacon and grilled burgers filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversations. James took a seat at a small booth in the corner, hoping to enjoy a quiet meal after a long day. He didn't expect much, just some hot food and a few moments to relax before heading home. That's when Tom, a burly man in his early 30s with a frown on his face, approached his table. James had seen Tom before, though they had never interacted. He was one of those people who seemed to carry a chip on his shoulder, always appearing irritated or displeased. "What'll it be?" Tom asked, his tone flat, eyes narrowing as he looked James up and down. James, maintaining his usual calm demeanor, picked up the menu. "I'll have the bacon cheeseburger with fries," he said, handing the menu back, "and a coffee." Tom snatched the menu from James's hand with a bit more force than necessary. "Right, got it," he muttered before turning on his heel and heading back to the kitchen. As James waited, he couldn't help but notice the shift in atmosphere around him. Tom, who had been relatively courteous to the other patrons, now seemed different, agitated and almost hostile. James had experienced this kind of treatment before. It wasn't always about what was said, but how it was said. The body language, the tone of voice, it all added up to a familiar pattern of discrimination that James knew all too well. Still, James remained calm, choosing not to let it bother him. He focused on his surroundings, the clink of dishes being washed in the back, the quiet chatter of families enjoying their meals. He was just here to eat, nothing more. But when Tom returned, he wasn't carrying food. Instead, he came back empty-handed, his expression twisted into something that resembled a sneer. He stood over the table, looking down at James with barely disguised disdain. "We're full," Tom said, his voice sharp. James looked around the restaurant, confused. The diner was half empty, with plenty of open tables. "Full?" he repeated, his brow furrowing. "There's plenty of space." Tom crossed his arms, clearly growing more impatient. "I said we're full. You'll have to leave." James blinked, the meaning behind Tom's words slowly sinking in. He had been here before, in moments just like this, where the rules seemed to shift depending on the color of his skin. He could feel the tension in the air now, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "I've already ordered," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just here for a meal, same as anyone else." Tom leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You need to go," he hissed, loud enough for the nearby customers to hear but not quite enough to draw the attention of the entire diner. "We don't serve people like you here." There it was, the truth, laid bare in a few hateful words. James felt his jaw tighten, the old anger rising in his chest. He had fought for this country, risked his life to protect the freedoms of everyone who called it home, including men like Tom. Yet here he was being treated like he didn't belong, like he hadn't earned the right to sit in a restaurant and enjoy a simple meal. But James had learned long ago to keep his emotions in check. He wasn't going to give Tom the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, he stood up slowly, meeting Tom's gaze with quiet strength. "I see," James said, his voice steady. "If that's how it is, then I'll leave." Without another word, James turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the injustice he had just endured. But as he pushed open the door and stepped outside, he had no idea that he wasn't the only one watching. At a table near the back of the diner, a woman sat with her notebook open and pen in hand. Angela Martin, a reporter for the local paper, had been spending the past few days shadowing the restaurant for a feature article on small-town businesses. She had watched the entire interaction unfold, and something about the way Tom had treated James had set off alarm bells in her mind. Angela had seen enough in her line of work to recognize the ugly face of racism when it happens. She had been observing from the corner, silently taking notes, and now, with a determined set to her jaw, she knew exactly what her next story was going to be. James may have walked out quietly, but this was far from over. Someone had been watching, and justice was about to come knocking on the door of Harrison's diner. Angela Martin sat at her booth, her heart racing as she watched James leave the diner. Her eyes lingered on the door as it closed behind him, and the tension in the air seemed to vanish the moment he was gone. She looked around at the other diners, most of whom had either ignored or chosen not to acknowledge what had just happened. It wasn't the first time Angela had witnessed casual racism in a small-town setting, but the brazenness of it, the audacity of Tom's words, had shocked her. She glanced down at her notebook, where she had been jotting down notes for the piece she was working on. Up until a few minutes ago, she had been focusing on the diner's history, its reputation as a sweet local spot, and its long-standing place in the community. Now her mind was buzzing with a new idea, one that had nothing to do with the feature article she'd originally planned. Angela closed her notebook, her mind already working through the steps she needed to take. She wasn't just a passive observer anymore. This story was bigger than a simple profile of a restaurant. This was about justice, about calling out the kind of discrimination that often went unchecked in towns like this. She had seen it before, but now she had a front row seat, and she wasn't going to let it slide. After a moment, Angela stood up, quietly making her way to the front counter. Tom was there, wiping his hands on a rag, looking smug. She felt a surge of anger, but kept her expression neutral. "Hey," Angela said casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Can I get a refill on my coffee?" Tom grunted and grabbed the coffee pot, filling her cup without looking her in the eye. As he handed it back, Angela studied him closely, noting the hard set of his jaw and the slight sneer that seemed to permanently curve his lips. "That guy you just kicked out?" Angela began, her voice light but probing. "He didn't look like he was causing any trouble. What was that all about?" Tom shot her a glance, clearly annoyed by the question. "None of your business," he muttered. "Guy like that doesn't belong here anyway." Angela's stomach turned at his words. "A guy like that?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "He was a veteran, you know. Did you see the patch on his jacket?" Tom snorted dismissively. "Doesn't matter, don't care who he is. People like him just don't fit in around here." Angela nodded slowly, keeping her emotions in check. She didn't want to tip him off just yet. Not until she had more to work with. She'd seen men like Tom before, ignorant, full of hate, and convinced they were invincible in their little bubbles of prejudice. But that bubble was about to burst, and Angela was going to make sure of it. "Right," Angela said, taking her coffee and heading back to her booth. She opened her notebook again, but this time, her focus wasn't on the diner's charming decor or the small-town nostalgia it was supposed to evoke. Instead, she began writing about what she had just witnessed, the interaction between Tom and James, the obvious racism, and the way the other customers had looked away, as if it wasn't their problem. Angela knew she needed more than just her notes. She needed to talk to James, to hear his side of the story and get his perspective. She didn't want to rush into writing an exposé without knowing the full picture. But first, she needed to find him. After paying her bill, Angela left the diner and scanned the street outside. She wasn't sure where James had gone, but she knew there was a veterans community center a few blocks away. It was a long shot, but it was as good a place as any to start. As she walked toward the center, Angela replayed the encounter in her mind, the way James had handled the situation with such quiet dignity. She couldn't stop thinking about how calm he had remained, even in the face of such disrespect. It was clear he had been through situations like this before, likely too many times to count. When Angela arrived at the Veteran Center, she found James sitting on a bench outside, staring off into the distance. His shoulders were tense, and there was a quiet stillness about him, as though he was deep in thought. Angela hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach him, but she knew she couldn't walk away now. "Excuse me," she said softly, stepping closer. James turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. Angela could see the exhaustion in his face, the weariness of someone who had carried the weight of the world for too long. "Do I know you?" James asked, his voice low but not harsh. "No," Angela replied, offering a small smile. "My name is Angela. I was in the diner earlier, and I saw what happened. I'm a reporter." James's expression shifted slightly, and he straightened up. "A reporter, huh?" he said, his tone cautious. "What's a reporter doing in a place like that?" Angela shrugged, sitting down on the bench beside him. "I was working on a story, but I think I found a more important one. I saw how that guy treated you. I wanted to see if you'd be willing to talk about it." James sighed, running a hand over his face. "You want a story about racism in a small-town diner?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "That's nothing new. Happens all the time." "I'm sure it does," Angela said, her voice gentle. "But that doesn't mean it should go unnoticed. You didn't deserve what happened in there, and I think people need to know about it, about what you've been through." For a moment, James was silent. He stared out at the street, his jaw tightening as he considered her words. "I'm tired," he said finally. "Tired of fighting battles I shouldn't have to fight. But if my story can make a difference, maybe it's worth talking about." Angela nodded, feeling a sense of relief. "I promise I'll handle it with care," she said. "Your story deserves to be told." James looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's talk." Angela Martin sat across from James, her notepad open and pen in hand. The quiet hum of the Veterans Center in the background created a sense of calm as they began to talk. James seemed hesitant at first, his gaze fixed on the pavement as though he wasn't sure how much to say. But after a moment he looked up at Angela. "I've been through worse, you know," James began, his voice low but steady. "Serving overseas, you deal with danger every day. Bullets, explosions, it's part of the job. But what really gets you is coming home and feeling like you're still fighting, just in a different way." Angela nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. "It shouldn't have to be like that," she said softly, "especially not for someone who's given so much." James sighed and leaned back against the bench, his eyes briefly closing as if gathering the strength to continue. "When I first got back from the Gulf War, I thought things might be different. People would recognize what I'd done for this country, that I'd earned my place. But in a lot of ways, things were the same, sometimes worse. It didn't matter that I'd worn the uniform. When people look at me, they don't see a veteran. They see a black man. And for some, that's all that matters." Angela scribbled in her notepad, feeling a growing sense of outrage on his behalf. The story she'd thought she was going to write, the one about small-town charm and community, had quickly transformed into something much more significant. This was about systemic issues, about the way certain people were treated based solely on the color of their skin, even when they had risked their lives for their country. "Has this kind of thing happened before?" Angela asked, keeping her tone gentle. James chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Plenty of times. You get used to it after a while. The side glances, the extra attention from store security, people acting like you don't belong. It's exhausting, but you learn to just keep your head down and move on. I don't like making waves." Angela studied him for a moment. He was the picture of quiet strength, someone who had endured so much yet chose not to let it break him. But Angela knew that people like Tom, the man at the diner, thrived on the silence of people like James. They counted on them not making waves, not fighting back. That silence was what allowed people like Tom to continue treating others with hatred, knowing they would likely get away with it. "Well," Angela said, determination hardening in her chest, "you deserve better, and this time we're not going to let it slide." James glanced at her, curious. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to write about this," Angela replied, her voice firm. "I'm going to expose what happened at that diner, and I'm going to make sure people hear your story. You're not just another black man mistreated because of his skin color. You're a veteran. You served this country. People need to know how you've been treated, and that it's unacceptable." James looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. "You really think it'll make a difference?" he asked quietly. Angela smiled. "I know it will." They talked for another hour, with James sharing more about his experiences in the military and the struggles he faced after returning home. By the time they were finished, Angela had pages of notes and a clear sense of where she wanted to take the story. It wasn't just about the incident at the diner. It was about the larger picture of racism and how veterans of color were often overlooked and mistreated, even after making the ultimate sacrifice for their country. That evening, Angela returned to her apartment and began writing. The words flowed easily, fueled by a mix of anger and passion. She crafted the story with care, detailing the incident at the diner and framing it within the broader context of James's life as a veteran. She included quotes from their conversation, highlighting his service and the challenges he had faced since returning home. Once the article was written, Angela reached out to her editor at the local paper. Paul, a veteran journalist himself, was known for his keen eye for important stories. When he read Angela's draft, his response was immediate. "This is powerful," Paul said over the phone, his voice thoughtful. "We need to run this as soon as possible. People need to hear about this." Angela felt a surge of relief and excitement. "Do you think it'll have an impact?" "More than you know," Paul replied. "This kind of story will roll. It's not just about one bad employee, it's about how we treat people who've given everything for this country. It's going to get attention." The article went live the next morning. Within hours, it began to gain traction. Social media lit up with people sharing the story, expressing outrage at how James had been treated and calling for action. Local veterans groups began organizing, with members reaching out to the diner's management, demanding accountability. The online comments poured in, some offering support for James and others voicing their disgust at the obvious racism he had faced. Angela watched as her story spread, the ripple effect growing larger with each passing hour. What had started as a quiet moment of discrimination in a small-town diner was now becoming a much bigger issue, with people from across the country weighing in on the injustice. But the real impact came when the story caught the attention of national media outlets. One news network picked it up, then another. Soon, James was receiving calls from reporters and talk shows, all wanting to hear his story. Veterans organizations began mobilizing to offer support, and the community around the diner started to speak out as well. The pressure on Harrison's diner was mounting, and it wasn't long before the restaurant's management was forced to address the situation publicly. As the story of James Thornton's mistreatment at Harrison's diner spread, the community response was immediate and overwhelming. What had started as a local article exposing the racist at a small-town restaurant quickly turned into a national conversation about how veterans, particularly veterans of color, were treated in America. The ripple effect Angela had hoped for had turned into a tidal wave, and the pressure on the diner grew stronger by the day. At first, the management at Harrison's diner attempted to downplay the incident. Frank Harrison, the owner and a longtime figure in the town, issued a short statement saying the situation had been misunderstood and that the diner had always been a welcoming place for all customers. But it wasn't long before Frank realized that this wasn't just going to blow over. As social media erupted with calls for justice, it became clear that the diner's reputation was on the line. Local veterans organizations were some of the first to step forward. The American Legion chapter in town, along with several other groups urging people to stand in solidarity with James and against the discrimination he had faced. Signs went up around town, with slogans like "Support our veterans" and "End racism now." The once busy diner began to feel the sting of empty seats and declining customer numbers. Meanwhile, James was thrust into the spotlight in a way he had never wanted or expected. News stations from across the country reached out for interviews, and veterans from all walks of life sent messages of support. Some veterans shared their own stories of discrimination, while others expressed their anger that someone who had served their country could be treated with such disrespect. James, always a man of quiet humility, found it difficult to navigate the sudden attention. He had never sought out fame or recognition, and the idea of becoming the face of a movement was overwhelming. But Angela had been right. The story was bigger than just one man. It was about a system of injustice that too many people had suffered through in silence. Now, with the spotlight shining on this one small-town diner, there was an opportunity to demand change. Angela stayed by James's side as the media storm grew. She helped him prepare for interviews and supported him as he struggled with the emotions stirred up by the flood of attention. In a way, their bond had become something deeper than journalist and source. They were partners in a mission to shine a light on something that had long been hidden in the shadows. One afternoon, as James sat with Angela at the Veterans Center, his phone rang. It was a call from Congressman David Walker, a well-known advocate for veterans' rights. Congressman Walker had seen the story and was moved by James's dignity and resilience in the face of discrimination. He wanted to honor James for his service not just in the military, but for standing up against the injustice he had faced at Harrison's Diner. "I want to do more than just offer you my thanks," Congressman Walker said over the phone. "You've become a symbol of something much larger, and I believe your story has the power to bring about real change. I'd like to invite you to Washington, D.C., where we can discuss ways to improve the treatment of veterans, particularly veterans of color, across the country." James was stunned. The idea of traveling to D.C. to meet with a congressman was far beyond anything he had imagined when he walked into the diner that day. But as the reality of the offer sank in, James felt a growing sense of purpose. Maybe this was his chance to make a real difference, not just for himself, but for others who had faced the same struggles. "I'd be honored," James replied, his voice steady. "Thank you, Congressman. I'll be there." The news of James' upcoming trip to Washington made headlines, and soon, a special event was planned in his honor at the Veterans Center. The local community, which had initially been shocked by the story, began to rally around James. People who had once been regulars at Harrison's Diner started avoiding the restaurant, and donations poured in to support veterans' causes. The town, once silent on issues of race and discrimination, was now engaged in conversations about how to be better allies and advocates for justice. The day of the event arrived, and the Veterans Center was packed with people from all walks of life. Veterans, local activists, and community members gathered to honor James for his service and for the courage he had shown in the face of adversity. Angela sat in the front row, watching as James took the stage. Dressed in his military uniform, James looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with emotion. He had never been one for speeches, but today felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. "Thank you," James began, his voice strong and clear. "Thank you for standing with me. What happened at Harrison's Diner wasn't just about one bad experience, it's about something much larger. It's about how we, as veterans and as human beings, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter the color of our skin." The crowd applauded, and James continued. "For too long, people like me have been told to keep our heads down, to stay quiet and move on. But I'm here to say that we don't have to be silent anymore. We don't have to accept injustice. We can stand up, speak out, and demand better treatment, for ourselves and for the generations to come." The applause grew louder, and as James stepped down from the stage, he was greeted with handshakes, hugs, and words of support from those in the crowd. Angela smiled at him, proud of the man she had come to know and respect. He had found his voice, and in doing so, he had given a voice to so many others. As the event came to a close, news broke that Harrison's Diner had officially fired Tom, the employee who had mistreated James. The diner's owner, Frank Harrison, issued a full apology, not just to James, but to the entire community. He pledged to undergo racial sensitivity training and to donate a portion of the diner's profits to veteran causes. James's story, once a quiet moment of discrimination in a small-town diner, had become a catalyst for change, not just in his town, but across the country. And as he prepared to leave for Washington, D.C., James knew that his journey was far from over. He had fought battles on the front lines, but now he was fighting a new battle. One for justice, equality, and the recognition that every person, no matter their race, deserved to be treated with dignity. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing inspiring stories like this one. We have many more powerful stories of resilience, family, and hope waiting for you. Click on the links on your screen to explore more heartwarming tales. Thank you for being part of our community, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.